Preview.
The story has been being told for some time, since the late 60s. It's not a new story. We have done a lot of research that puts information out that hasn't been put out before, the new book Captured. But it's an important story on several different levels. It was the first abduction experience to get any serious attention. It wasn't the first abduction. First one to get attention in John Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey. Now, it got attention in spite of the efforts of Betty and Barney, because they were very much concerned about what the impact would be on their lives if this story got out. Betty was a social worker, a supervisor in the welfare department, state of New Hampshire. Barney worked for the post office, was very active in civil rights. The last thing they needed was public attention about the strangest story you can imagine. Bad enough to see a flying saucer. People have been seeing them for years, many years. Even seeing crash flying saucers, as you heard in the previous talk. But now we're not talking about dead bodies. We're talking about live ones. We're not talking about wreckage. We're talking about a craft that comes down, does its thing, and leaves. Takes them on board against their will. This is a crazy story. So they made every effort to keep the story from getting out in the public because they were honestly and sincerely concerned about what it would mean to their lives, their jobs. As you may have noticed, this is an interracial couple. This was 1961 in New Hampshire. Such couples were not very common. Very special people. And I surprised some people by pointing out that even though you notice Barney died in 1969, February, I met him. He and Betty and I had dinner in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1968, November. And it was interesting because I got a call from the big radio station, big television station, KDKA. And I got started in public involvement on UFOs because I did a program on KDKA called, surprisingly enough, Contact. It was a call-in show. And I had asked Frank Edwards, who had a best-selling book about flying saucers, I said, I want to go public, Frank. I had met Frank. I'd been active for several years in finding out about saucers. Give me some names, Frank. You know everybody. He was a newsman in Indianapolis. He gave me some names in Pittsburgh, where I was living and working for Westinghouse. And one of them was the producer of this show, Contact. And I called them and gave them a spiel. And usually, being a nuclear physicist working for Westinghouse were gold-plated credentials in Pittsburgh. You know, you want to buy a house, how much do you want to borrow, that kind of thing. But their response was pretty much, don't call us, we'll call you. Well, less than a month later, they called me at 6:30 at night. Could I please be on their show at 7 o'clock? Somebody had canceled at the last minute, and Lord knows how many people they called before they got somebody like me who was willing to go on the show. So I did the show. I wasn't as good at handling the noisy negativist then as I am now, but somebody at work at Westinghouse heard me, asked me to talk to her book review club, which was looking at Frank's book. I gave my first lecture in her living room. I did the show many times over the next couple of years. And finally, after I'd done several shows for them, I got a call. Betty and Barney Hill are coming to town. We thought you might like to know. Now, normally, stations won't do that. They protect their guests. So they called me, told me what hotel they were staying at. I called them, went down, we had dinner together. I was very favorably impressed by them. I mean, I'd read the Look magazine article and John Fuller's book and so forth. So I can truthfully say I had a chance to interact with the both of them. I've seen Betty many times since at her home. We did television shows, The Tomorrow Show, other shows. My movie UFOs Are Real, there's some copies outside, interview done at Betty's house. So a very special twosome here. And if you look at the dates, you'll see Betty lived a much longer time than Barney. So these are the protagonists in this interesting story. But people with excellent reputations in their community who did not seek out publicity, talked to a lawyer about keeping the story from coming out. He said, there's nothing you can do. A reporter got a hold of it who wanted to interview them from a Boston newspaper, and it was the last thing they wanted, but he wanted to interview Dr. Simon, the psychiatrist. He wasn't having any either. So it's an interesting saga. This was second marriages. Well, they both had been married before. And a very special couple. Let's look at the next slide. And another character in this drama was Delcy, their dog, who was with them on the trip and whose behavior indicated great concern, at some time hiding under the seat, as I recall it. But she's not the little critter we want to talk about the most tonight. Let's look at the next slide. Now, you'll hear all kinds of crazy stories. One of the things about important stories, like Roswell and the Hill case, is that the nasty, noisy negativists really work overtime trying to put out garbage. And you'll see every aspect of each case being attacked by somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about, or if he does is intentionally lying, and I'm not going to pass judgment on that. You know, why they went on a trip. Betty had a week's vacation coming. Barney wanted to do something. They were fairly newly married. Celebrate in a special way. Betty had never been to Niagara Falls. Barney got time off from work. Well, she had a vacation. And they decided to go to Niagara Falls. Everybody's romantic objective, if you will. This is sort of like a honeymoon for them. And you may not recognize this person, but she's standing right here. This is Kathleen. And at the time, she was 13 years old. Should I say that? Yeah, you're not supposed to tell a woman's age, but that's all right. This was a girl's age, it was 13. She had been at Niagara Falls. And so she had told them about her trip, and that helped them understand, you know, why it was worth going there and so forth. The objective here was to drive to Niagara Falls, come back through Montreal, come on back home. They'd have a great weekend. You know, a break in the activities. But Kathy was around at the time, and there are some people who will tell you she was only 3 years old at the time. How does she know what was going on? They left off that little one. 13 and 3 are not the same, in case you hadn't noticed. Next one. So they were following a route. They'd gone over to Niagara Falls, which is from Thousand Islands. They came up through Montreal, had a great time in Montreal, and headed east from Montreal to Coaticook. I got it. I think I pronounced it properly. Yes. Close enough. Down through Colebrook. There's a border between Canada and the United States here. This is lovely farmland, dairy farms. I've been on that road. A rural area. Montreal isn't rural, believe me, but the countryside is. And things were going as one might expect them to go. They had thought they might stay over in Montreal. Barney got lost. All the signs were in French, and he didn't speak French. And so after they got through the town, they decided, oh, what the heck? He felt he was feeling great. We could drive on home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. These are not busy roads once you get past Montreal. It was at night. He was accustomed to working at night. So away we go. Next slide. Here's Coaticook, and it's Kathleen's turn to say something.
Betty and Barney stopped for dinner in Coaticook. They decided to use up the remainder of their Canadian money, and you might have heard that Barney was very upset during this trip because he had encountered some hoodlums who gave him a rough time about being married to a white woman. That is false. What actually happened is that Betty and Barney went into a restaurant. There were two young men in there who had what Barney described as duck bill haircuts, and it reminded him of the haircuts that hoodlum types were wearing at that time frame. But they were conventionally dressed, and Barney stated that they were very nice young men. They had a nice dinner in the restaurant, and then they left. After they left, they traveled through the Canadian countryside toward Vermont and then on to New Hampshire. This is one of the attractive farms that they passed along the way. And during the hypnosis, during this time frame, Dr. Simon was asking Barney how he felt, what his emotional state was. And I want to play for you now, Barney, in Barney's own words, how he felt.
I felt in good spirits. I felt in high spirits. I was well rested from the night before, and we had spent a delightful day. And I knew I could drive on from the White Mountains down to Portsmouth, so I didn't stop. I didn't feel too tired.
I hope that you could hear that. It was what he stated is written up there on the screen. Well, then they drove on and they passed through customs and Canaan, Vermont without any problems. And this is the route that they took. Here's Colebrook. This would have been their first stop after they left Canada. They got gasoline there and stopped at a restaurant again for a cup of coffee. Then they went on to Lancaster, the next city down, along Route 3, the major route that ran through northern New Hampshire. It still is the only major route in that part of northern New Hampshire. And then on to Twin Mountain. This is the town of Colebrook. They stopped at a restaurant there, Howard's Restaurant, and just had a cup of coffee. They knew it was the last opportunity they'd have probably to have a cup of coffee that night before they went home. And as they were leaving the restaurant, they noticed it was about 10 o'clock.
p.m. Things are quieting down in New Hampshire. No. They drove along to Lancaster. Now you see cars here, and you think, oh, it's pretty busy. There was nobody out. It was late at 10:50 is late at night in rural New Hampshire. This is off season. This is before the leaves turn beautiful. There's nothing much going on. No traffic. Very few things open of a commercial nature any place along this route. It's country. Pure and simple country. So don't be fooled by the cars. No traffic. Okay. And then they're driving south. Betty, on the right, in the passenger seat, of course, saw a strange new light in the sky. She was watching the sky. The skies are clear and beautiful down there. This is not Smogsville country at all. And as you'll see, the weather was great. And they saw this new light in the sky, except it was sort of like a meteor, except it was going up. Next slide. They were going from north to south, as you can see there. Okay, the first interview that was done at any length with them, after they made an initial report to Pease, the local police, and then Pease Air Force Base, was done by Walter Wett. He was a wheel at the planetarium in Boston. the lecturer, when he finished, I guess he was assistant directors. He was an investigator for the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, one of the two major groups at that time, APRO and NICAP, Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Now, after the event we'll be talking about, Betty went to the library, got a book out by Major Donald Kehoe, who had pretty much founded NICAP and was director, and it had an address to which you could write to report a sighting, and they requested that sightings be reported. And so she wrote a letter detailing what happened during this experience, as far as she knew at the time, anyway. And they, in turn, passed this on to Walter Webb. NICAP was in Washington, D.C. We're talking about New Hampshire. Nearest big city, Boston, of course. Walter Webb was their big shot investigator in Boston. They passed Betty's letter, naturally typed. She was a social worker. She was a supervisor in the welfare department of the state of New Hampshire. She was accustomed to writing reports. And it was detailed. So Walter called them within a couple of days after getting the letter from NICAP and arranged to meet them. And so we have a copy of that report. He's still around, incidentally. A little older, as most of us are now. And there's a quote here. The couple initially thought they were observing a falling star, only it moved upward, a plane or a satellite. Next slide. There were bright, you can see that up there. The first stop was near Twin Mountain. Now we're getting up to 11:20 p.m., even quieter. Nothing going on. Peaceful countryside. No hoodlums. There were bright colors like bright orange light, almost a reddish beam, and there were like a blue light on a police cruiser. They were just a flash of different colors. And I'd never seen anything like it before, and it was moving quite fast. Now, she's watching. Barney's driving. When I saw it go in front of the moon, I was sort of fascinated, and I kept watching. Now, note that. A later explanation is that this was Jupiter. Now, I can't remember the last time Jupiter went in front of the moon. It's 500 million miles out there. The moon's 250,000 miles out there. But let's look at the next slide. She was intrigued, in other words, and she's telling Barney, incidentally, about this. She's seeing a UFO, and he's, Betty, there are no UFOs. He was poo-pooing, and he was driving south. She's watching this thing and reporting to him. They went through Franconia Notch, which is, now, we say mountains in New Hampshire. When you're on the East Coast and you say mountains, you don't mean the Rockies. The highest point east of the Mississippi is in New Hampshire, Mount Washington, or one of the highest points, together with North Carolina. But you do have rolling country and some sharp hills. So you get this Franconia Notch, they call it. You can see why. It's sharp notch, not slowly rolling down kind of thing. This was taken a little later time in the year, and they get gorgeous color up there, but normally in October, not September. And then you'll have busloads full of tourists looking at the color, but not September 20th. Next slide. And then we see Cannon Mountain. There is a, well, you can see it there. There's a tramway, you know, it goes up and down, runs most of the year. Ski lift, if you want to call it that. Not at this time of year, of course. They do have skiing there. No, it's a beautiful local area, well known, and some people have suggested that what they saw was the light at the top of the mountain there. And as you will hear about all the things this crazy light did, you realize it couldn't have been. That lights at the top of the mountain stay in the same place normally. They don't move around, they don't fly in front of the moon, and, you know. So let's look at the next slide. Is that yours or mine?
Yours.
Now, I get a real kick out of the explanations about point sources, Jupiter. They also watched it go past one of the real emblems of New Hampshire, the Old Man of the Mountain, until it fell. And we went by where it was, and we were up there doing a television show, but this shape, as you can see, first seen in 1805 by a white man, looks like an old man of the mountain. They saw the UFO alongside it. Now it's 48 feet from chin to brow. It was about 1.5 times the height. That's not a point of light, in other words. Yeah, I better show you up here. So you see the idea. Here's the old man of the mountain. This now fell into a lake and you can't see it, but the saucer was next to it. But people want to explain it away and ignore this part of the testimony. If it was 48 feet, 1.5 times would be 72 feet. That's hardly a point source of light. And so many of the so-called explanations disappear. Okay.
They then made a second stop and got out of the car to look at this object in the sky. Betty had told Barney that it was moving erratically, and they both speculated that perhaps it was the movement of the car. And Betty was looking at this through binoculars as she was riding along. And so they decided to stop to see if it actually was moving erratically, or if it was only an object that was moving smoothly in the sky. And so I want to play for you now Barney's description of what they saw.
I'm going to report it. It wasn't far. It was about 1,000 feet, I guess. I know it is not a Piper Cub. It was too fast. It moved too fast. It would go up and down. It could go back so fast. It could go away and come back toward the west, and without looking as if it turned, it would come straight back. It would go like a I think of a paddle and a ball with a rubber. You hit the ball, and the ball goes straight out and comes straight back without a circle. And I think only a jet could fly that fast. And
So he thinks only a jet could fly that fast. The only problem is it was completely silent, and it had unconventional lighting, and they could see the windows in it. There were no red lights at that time. There was only a row of white lights, and it appeared to be rotating. Whoops. Here we go. They then returned to their car and drove south. The next area that they would have come to is known as Indian Head. This is the area where the tourists spend the night. There were cottages there at the time, and there were also some tourist attractions. What you see here is Indian Head. The Indian Head Resort is there. In 1961, there were only cabins. Today, it has grown into a big, beautiful resort. And I did want to mention that in September of 2011, the Indian Head Resort is going to host a 50th anniversary event to commemorate Betty and Barney Hill's experience. And they are going to dedicate a memorial to Betty and Barney. And there will be guided tours of the Close Encounter route. I will be giving those and also lecturing. So I hope that you will consider coming to that. As Betty and Barney passed those cabins, Betty saw someone standing in one of the windows. It was a man standing in a window. And she thought to herself, well, I could end all of this right now if we just stopped and spent the night at this cabin. But then she thought she was so curious, she wanted to see more of this. And Barney, having left this very desolate area, told Dr. Simon, and I quote, "I feel safe unless in the barren hostility of the wooded area. I've been here before, and I feel comforted that I see a familiar place." Now, Barney started to talk to Dr. Simon about Betty's reaction. Dr. Simon had asked him, and he said, "Betty is becoming excited about this thing." And Betty rarely becomes excited about anything. So something is going on here that is unusual. And I think that I want to stop and get a better look at this thing. So as he was driving south, he was looking for another place where he could pull over to the side of the road and stop. But before he had the opportunity to find a spot, this craft shifted ahead of them and stopped directly over the top of their vehicle, and then descended toward them, causing Barney to have to stop the car directly in the middle of the road.
Now we're at 12:15 a.m. Now he stopped in the middle of the road, and you might think, well, that was not a very bright thing to do, but there was nobody around. There was no traffic. And he says it continued to have a forward look, facing me as if it swung and did not move from its position, but just swung around with the front still facing me, and it moved to my left, and I continued to look and began walking across the highway from the car, got out of the car, going across the highway. There's a field over there, and
Barney walked toward the craft, holding the binoculars up to his eyes. And what I want to do now is to play for you 2 tape recordings of Barney's statements about what he saw. The first recording is his first session with Dr. Simon. And Dr. Simon brought on this tremendous release of emotion in Barney at this point. This is the place where Barney's mental block set in. He recalled a close encounter with this craft. He recalled observing non-human entities on board the craft. In fact, his statement to Walter Webb in the initial report was that they were somehow not human. In Betty's letter, written September 25th, 1961, to NICAP, she reported that Barney had observed figures on board this craft, and there was something about their appearance that had frightened him so badly that he had developed a mental block, and they were considering finding a competent psychiatrist who would use hypnosis to help Barney understand what it was that caused this mental block. So the first tape I'm going to play for you is this first session.
Keep looking. Just keep looking and stay there. And just keep looking. Just keep looking.
Could you hear him tell you?
Oh, I gotta pull these binoculars away from my eyes. Because if I don't, I'll just keep staying there.
Could you hear him tell you this?
Oh, no, he didn't say it.
You felt he said it.
I know.
You know he said
Just
it.
there, yeah. Just stay there, he's saying to me. It's
All right.
pounding in my head. Just
All
don't
right.
pull the binoculars away. God, give me strength.
All right.
Pull them down. Run! Pull these binoculars down and run! God! It says, God, give me strength. I gotta get away. Oh! Betty!
All right.
We gotta get away, Betty!
All right. Calm down. Calm down.
I'm driving.
Calm
I gotta
down.
get away.
How could you be sure he was telling you this? Calm down. You're still asleep. you be sure he was telling you this?
Eyes. His eyes. I've never seen his eyes before.
But you said they were friendly. You said they were friendly.
Oh, no. Not the leaders. I said only he wasn't looking over his shoulder.
Oh, I see. The leader was
friendly.
How did you know the other one was the leader?
Because everybody moved. Everyone was standing there looking at me. But everybody moved to these levers or in the back, or they went to this big board. They looked like it looked like a board. And only this one with the black shiny jacket and the scarf stayed at the window.
There's some real terror there, you might have noticed.
Now I'm going to play the excerpt from the second hypnosis session where Barney was reliving the same experience with less emotion and was able to give Dr. Simon a little more detail about what he observed.
I noticed with my binoculars that there were about 11 men now, I thought, looking down at me, and they suddenly made a turn to what I thought was a panel, and I could see their arms going up, and there was one that kept looking down, and I kept going closer, and I could see two red lights coming out from the tip of this thing that did not look like a plane at all, or a helicopter, and I could see a long something coming down from the center, and I kept going closer and closer, and I thought, oh my God, what is this thing? And I felt myself being told to come closer, and I was greatly confused, and I blinked my eyes, and I thought, this can't be real. And I shook my head and turned it away and looked back, and I thought, oh God, it's there. What is this thing? And I put my hand toward my gun, and I could not put my hand there, and I could not understand why my hands kept going up with the binoculars, and I was told to keep the binoculars up and keep looking up and keep coming closer. No harm would come to me. And that's when I opened my hands, and the binoculars fell around my neck, and I ran screaming back to the car that they were going to capture us, and yet I could not understand what they wanted to capture us for. And I thought I should report this to the police if ever I could find a call box or anything, or a restaurant open, because this was very unusual for something to do that. And I thought of the military, and I thought since they had on black jacket, the one looking at me had on a black jacket, he must have been a military officer, and yet I could not quite understand why they were doing what they were doing, and there was no sound coming from this thing.
Barney then finally managed to pull those binoculars down, and when he arrived home, the leather strap on the binoculars was broken. And this must have been the point where he broke that strap, where he pulled so violently in order to overcome this thought that he was getting from the leader on this craft to keep them up at his eyes. He pulled it down and ran back to the car, screaming to Betty that they had to get out of there or they were going to be captured. Betty was seated in the car all of this time. The door was cracked open. I imagine the interior light in the car was on. And she was calling for Barney after a few minutes. And when he didn't come back, she was becoming very upset. And she felt that if he hadn't come back when he did, she was going to get out of the car and go into that field and look for him. As Barney was returning to the car, running back, he noticed that the craft had shifted overhead above the vehicle. Whoa. And he told Betty to look up and see if she could see the craft. So she rolled down the window and she looked up and she couldn't see it. All she could see is blackness. She couldn't see the stars. She couldn't see the sky. She saw only blackness. And I'm going to play for you now her description of what happened next.
She's inside the car, looking up, out the window.
There was this beep, 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 beep noise, and Barney said, "What's that? What's that? What's that noise?" And I said, "I don't know. It sounds, all I could think of is some kind of electrical signal. Somebody's, it's beep, 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 beep." And I thought, well, I wonder, oh, darn, why didn't I learn the Morse code? Because maybe this is the Morse code and I don't know it. And I thought, well, maybe it's electrical. It's a shock. Get it, I can. So I put my hand on the metal of the car, and I kept feeling and feeling, and I didn't feel any shock, no electric shock. But the whole car was vibrating.
The car was vibrating, and there was a tingling sensation that passed through Betty's and Barney's bodies and caused them to feel a little numb. The next thing they knew, they were 35 miles south of the fields. They hadn't spoken another word to each other. You would think that Betty would have asked Barney what he had observed in the field. You would think that they would be discussing this thing. They didn't. They didn't speak for 35 miles, as far as they could remember.
They know from the signs on the road how many miles to some place, you see.
Yes. Okay? This is a map. Okay, this is Twin Mountain. Their first stop was at the Mount Cleveland picnic area here, just south of Twin Mountain, at about 10:50 p.m. It might have been a little earlier than that when they arrived, but when I was driving through, reenacting their trip for myself, I had to drive more slowly than Betty and Barney were driving back then. It's more heavily populated now. Barney was driving along at a fairly rapid clip, 50, 55 miles an hour, according to his testimony. We had to slow down as we were passing through. Here's the old man of the mountain. That's the second stop. I estimated it was about 11:50, but when Betty passed by Cannon Mountain, she told Dr. Simon that she looked at her watch and she thought it was about 11:20 at that time. So I, again, may be off. This is the third stop at the Close Encounter Field. They thought it was about midnight then. I arrived, it would have been about 12:15. And then later on they found out that there was a capture site that they didn't recall initially until hypnosis, and this is where that was located.
Now, a point that needs to be made, when we were there to do a movie, and I won't talk about the movie, but when you're standing at that location where Barney was looking with his glasses, and you realize that very shortly after that, he gets off the main road, onto a secondary road, and then onto a dirt road. There is no possible way he would have done that on his own. Makes absolutely no sense. He was being directed to a rather unique spot in the whole area. This is a heavily wooded part of the country, as you can see. The trees are tall. This is not New Mexico desert. This is wooded New Hampshire. And yet they wind up on this very narrow road, no lights, no traffic, no people, no buildings. Why would anybody go there, you know? And they see a roadblock and beings, men in the road. they couldn't make any sense out of this. What was going on here? Is there an accident? There's no traffic. There's no reason for there to be anybody there. So let's look at the next slide.
Yes. I just wanted to mention that in their conscious recollection, there was a roadblock. They just didn't know when or where it occurred. That was a mystery.
And they saw this, you can call it a fiery orb, a bright light, some source of light ahead of them in the road. It was moving, but they weren't moving. They thought it might be the moon, but obviously the moon isn't down on road level. It couldn't have been the moon. So they're totally puzzled about this situation. What's going on? What's happening? Let's look at the...
And I'd like to play for you Barney's statement about that experience. This was part.
The moon be on the highway in that kind of position, and I could never seem to find any terrain up there that would fit what I sort of dimly remembered this thing was sitting there like. And I kept remembering these men flagging me down, and then I sort of don't remember. And now I remember.
Okay. Next thing they remember is this gap. They see this orb, whatever it is in the road. They see men, beings around it. And then it's like everything fades out. And the next thing they remember is another set of these buzzing, beeping sounds, the car shaking maybe. And they're 35 miles down the road. And now they're back in full consciousness, except that it's seamless. They'd been alert and awake. Now they're alert and awake, and in between, nothing. How do you drive a car without knowing what you're doing, you know? So let's look at the next one. And so they kept on about their business, coming down this way, heading. Portsmouth is on the coast, on the Atlantic coast. Concord's the capital, and so many of the signs said how far it was to Concord. That's your measuring label here. And they expected to get home about 3 in the morning. But that's not what happened. They arrived home
At 5:15 a.m. They checked their watches when they arrived home, but they were no longer working. They wound them. Those watches never worked again. They went into the house. Barney went into the house first. He looked at the clock. It was about 5:15 a.m. He said, "Arrived a little bit later than I anticipated." Betty stayed outside walking the dog Delcy, and she talked about how she could hear the birds chirping. It was already daylight.
This is September, mind you, September 20th. The birds shouldn't be chirping at 3 in the morning.
Barney sensed a strange sensation in his groin, a little itchiness, and he went into the bathroom and checked himself to see what was wrong. He didn't see anything then, but not long after that, 21 3/4-inch growths appeared in a perfect concentric circle on his groin. Later, under hypnosis, he would tell Dr. Simon that he could feel a cup-like device being placed over his groin in that exact location. Those growths became infected, inflamed, when Barney was undergoing hypnosis with Dr. Simon, and he had to have them surgically removed at that time.
This is 2 years after the event, mind you.
But the growths appeared shortly thereafter the event.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the inflammation was later.
Yes, it was later. So I do want to stress the point that the lab report stated that they were not venereal warts. The debunkers tend to say that that's what they were. They were not. He and Betty felt clammy, as if they had been contaminated by something, more than anyone would feel just from driving from Montreal to New Hampshire. and as I said, the binocular strap was broken, and their watches had stopped and never worked again. The tops of Barney's shoes were scraped. He was a meticulous dresser. He had to wear those shoes for yard work after that. He had no explanation, logical explanation, for how this had happened. They weren't just slightly scuffed. They were scraped. His words were, they were scraped. They went into separate rooms, and they drew sketches of what they had observed.
Standard practice. You do it with your kids. They both say they saw something. Well, you sit down here and draw what you saw, and you sit down here and draw what you saw. So they each drew what they could recall. This is without hypnosis at this point in time. And two drawings, pretty darn similar. And it should be noted that these kind of wings, or whatever you want to call them, slid out from the side. So red light, then gradually as it came closer to the ground, and there were windows with beings being seen on the other side. Neither one of these two was a great artist, you understand, but close enough to say that they were drawing the same thing. This was a temporary, apparently, appendage. I call it a wing, but that's probably not a good name for it. Okay.
And I just did want to mention that Barney drew figures behind the windows, whereas Betty did not. That's because Barney observed those figures when he was in the field.
And had the binoculars.
And Betty was in the car. So she was drawing what she saw initially in the car before the craft shifted over the field and Barney walked toward it. Now, Betty had put on a fairly new dress the morning of the trip from Montreal to Portsmouth. And when she arrived home, the zipper was torn. At the top of the zipper, there was a 2-inch tear on one side and a 1-inch tear on the other side. No mundane explanation for that. All she did is ride in the car. She got out a few times. She ate at a couple of restaurants. No explanation for this. The lining was torn from waist to hemline, and the hem was torn down on one side. She knew it had to be repaired, so she folded it up and she placed it in her closet. The next time she went to her closet to retrieve the dress, it was covered with a pink powdery substance that degraded the fabric and destroyed the dress. She hung the dress up on the clothesline. The pink powder blew away, but it had discolored the dress permanently. And this is the dress here. You can see that part of it, this area right here, is still blue. That was the original blue color of the dress. But there are areas where it was completely saturated with this pink powdery substance. And these were the areas where Betty later told Dr. Simon that these alien beings who had abducted her had wrapped their hands around her shoulders. There's another view of the dress. You can see that some swaths have been cut out of the dress. Those were for the chemical analyses that the dress underwent. They underwent 4 chemical analyses, and I have written about that in Captured. And they also were used in a seed growth experiment. This is Phyllis Budinger. She has a master's degree in chemistry. She did the most extensive chemical analysis on the dress. She was a research scientist for BP Amoco, previously Standard Oil, for 35 years. She specialized in petroleum chemical and polymer analyses using spectroscopic techniques. And currently, she is the technical director of Frontier Analysis Limited Laboratory in Chagrin Falls, Ohio.
A quite respectable chemist.
You can read more about it in Captured, but her conclusion at the end of this analysis was, and I quote, "I am convinced that the event did happen as determined by the chemical analysis I did on Betty Hill's dress. Well, my mother was the first person that Betty called when she arrived home. Barney had advised her that they should forget about the entire event, that no good could possibly come of it. But Betty and my mother were very close and lived 20 miles apart. And so when she called my mother suggested that she would call a neighbor of ours who was a physicist and see what the physicist had to say about this whole thing. Betty was worried about contamination, what might have happened to them. And the physicist told my mother to advise Betty that if she had a compass, she should take it out to the car to see how the needle of the compass would react. She did find a compass, and she took it out, and when she went out there, she noticed there were some new, very shiny spots on the trunk of the vehicle that hadn't been there the day before. There were 12 to 18 of them, and they were very shiny. And I'm going to play for you both Betty's and Barney's descriptions of what those spots looked like. I also saw these spots. This is a facsimile because none of us thought to take a photograph of those spots. But this is based upon Betty's and Barney's descriptions and upon my memory of what I observed.
There was nothing about an abduction up to this point in their minds. So the significance wasn't yet known of this whole experience.
Yeah, it was like a lacquer put on over the color. And even when I waxed the car, the spot still was shinier. And it had been raining that day. And the car was all wet, still wet. And I thought, well, I started on the side of the car to see what would happen, and I kept going closer and closer to the trunk. And then it was when I started to go to the trunk with the compass that I noticed the shiny spots on the trunk. That there were these very, very shiny spots. About the whole cluster of them, about the size of, I don't know, $50 or silver dollar, something like that. And there must have been, 12 or 18, there were several, over a dozen, I would say, all around this spot and very shiny. And when I just got the compass anywhere near them, the compass kept spinning around and around and around. And at this I panicked. I got more upset at this one spot than I did
at anything, she said. Now let's listen to what Barney said.
And I said, how can you not know if it isn't anything? And then I put the compass close to it, and the compass would spin and spin, and I could move the compass a few inches to a spot that did not contain, to a part on the trunk that did not have a spot, and the compass would drop down. And
so you can see that Betty and Barney's description of those spots and how the compass needle reacted were consistent.
Nobody understands why that would happen, you understand.
The spots were located in the exact location where the Hills said they heard beeping or buzzing sounds that caused the vehicle to vibrate, and that vibration to cause their bodies to tingle. Betty washed and waxed the vehicle, but the spots wouldn't rub out, but they faded away over the winter of 1961 to 1962. I do have a letter in the book, quotes from a letter, of a meeting that Betty and Barney had with Air Force officers at their church rectory, where they discussed the spots on the trunk of the car and speculated about what might have caused this. This wasn't part of the official Blue Book record. It was a meeting brought together. Betty and Barney could never understand why these officers came to this meeting. It was supposed to be to listen to poetry written by one of the officers. But after he read his poems, the officers asked Betty and Barney to stay, and they had a conversation about the spots on the trunk of the vehicle.
Barney knew people at the base because of his work with civil rights, you see. So there was a connection with the base, Pease Air Force Base, just outside Portsmouth.
Now, there has been some speculation that they might have just been weather spots. Weather spots develop when it rains, atmospheric pollutants drop down in the rain, they deposit on the vehicle, then the sun comes out and bakes those spots on the car. And you have to use a chemical solution to get them off. They don't rub off very easily. This is what weather marks look like. And you can see here that this is not what Betty's and Barney's marks looked like, does not fit the description. And then here is the facsimile again, just so that you can see the difference.
They called the local police. They advised them to call nearby Pease Air Force Base. They did. They made a report. They were treated fairly decently. A record was kept. Here's the official Project Blue Book Air Intelligence Information Report. It was taken seriously. The report also included the interesting, where's the comment about the radar there? What is that? Oh, on this one. Mm-hmm. I can't read it, though. Can you read it? There was a radar report
yes,
that
there was a
night
radar
as well.
report. It says it was revealed that a strange incident occurred at 211 local on the 20th of September. No importance was attached to the incident at the time. Subsequent interrogation failed to bring out any information in addition to that of the extract of the daily controller.
And there was also a report on another radar installation up in, where are we? In
North
Vermont.
Concord, Vermont.
Yeah.
Yes.
Blue Book tried to push this aside, and there have been a number of instances noted where they've changed files and records and so forth. But what I'm saying is here's a definite record of something happening at the right time and place and so forth. They were taken seriously. Let's look at the next one.
But I want to mention that this is the original handwritten report. And in the original report, the Air Force said that there was a strong inversion in that in the Lincoln, New Hampshire area that night. And a temperature inversion will cause a distant object to appear much closer than it is. And one of their favorite theories was that this might explain UFO sightings that people had.
It was a favorite for the Washington National Airport sightings. The only trouble is when you check the weather records, there wasn't any temperature inversion. And this is from the Mount Washington's the tallest point in New Hampshire, tallest point on the East Coast. The official weather station archival records. Looking back on our records for the dates in question, it appears that the 19th and 20th were both beautiful late summer days atop the rock pile. Mount Washington was the rock pile. They had some of the strongest winds in the country on average, terrible winters, rugged kind of place. The evening and nighttime conditions for the 19th were quite tranquil. Winds were from the west at around 25 miles per hour. Visibility was 130 miles throughout the night, but dropped to 75 miles during the morning hours of the 20th. There was a movie, well, we'll talk about that, but in which the windshield wipers are shown going like mad. It wasn't raining. When you got 130 miles visibility, it's not bad weather.
Some critics have also stated that the weather people at the top of Mount Washington would have observed the craft if it had really been there on that night. There was a letter written to the weathermen up there, and they said that due to their job, the type of job they had, they only went outside of the building at night in order to check the temperature gauges outside, and then they returned to the building. They would not have observed anything in the sky that night.
They're not looking around. Are there any flying saucers, folks? No. The chief meteorologist said it is possible a weak inversion set up in the valleys overnight, as the valley locations are more prone to the diurnal day-night effects of the sun. But I think that the cloud cover would have prevented any radiational cooling in the valley, so there wasn't any inversion. That's what the chief meteorologist said. And as things went on, and we haven't mentioned that, but we did mention you'd gone down there,
Yes.
seen the car, witnessed it, so personal experience, etc. 10 days later, about, Betty began to have nightmares. We had 5 of them. They included a conscious memory of a close encounter with a UFO. She also dreamed of an abduction by the craft's occupants. I think you're all aware that sometimes the events of our daytime life show up in our dreams. So something was going on here, but Betty being Betty, she recorded the dreams. She kept a record of them. Now remember, Barney worked nights. Betty worked days. Let's look at the next. Okay, now the event took place in 1961, September. Okay, Barney developed some ulcers, some problems, health problems, went to a doctor, got to take care of the ulcer problem, got blood pressure problems. And the doctor told Barney that, look, I've done all I can for you with conventional medicine. Something else is going on here. He recommended that they see a psychiatrist. Because you remember back then, ulcers were thought to be caused by mental stress, and if you could control the stresses, you could take care of the ulcers to some extent. To make a long story short, he wound up in the office of Dr. Benjamin Simon. Now, Benjamin Simon didn't know a darn thing about UFOs, but he was a world-class expert on helping people uncover hidden memories, if you will, specifically dealing with World War II shell-shock war veterans. That's what they used to call it. Today it's post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, your buddy's head gets blown off next to you. It's a little hard to integrate that into your life. Why me, or him, not me, and how do I live with that? And, these are people are coming back from Iraq or Afghanistan with these things. And so Dr. Simon actually ran a hospital with 3,000 beds for shell-shock war veterans. He had the greatest success of any of the psychiatrists. It's never 100%, I better add. Not everybody is able to get back to a normal life. But he even stars in a movie, Let There Be Light, that the showing his techniques that he had developed using regressive hypnosis. Somebody who was blind was able to see again. We're not talking mythical stories here. The Army wanted these people to get back to living again. And Dr. Simon was the best equipped probably of anybody around who could have had the chore of trying to uncover what happened. He was down in Boston, and he conducted his sessions each separately, not together, and induced amnesia at the end of each session. 2 purposes. They couldn't remember it themselves, and they couldn't talk to the other one about it. He was taping all these sessions, and eventually played back the tapes to them together. And his whole purpose was to get the feelings out and have them relive these experiences so he could show them they're okay now, they can live with it, the truth shall set you free. I don't know who said that. I don't know who said that, but it doesn't matter. So Ben Simon was not an expert on flying saucers. And in listening to the tapes, sometimes you get the feeling, why didn't he ask him this, that, or the other thing? Well, he wasn't interested in the saucer part of the story. He was interested in helping two obviously sensible, sensitive, intelligent people get their lives back after what was clearly a strange experience that was disturbing to them. So it wasn't the next week, the next month. It wasn't, Carl Sagan did an article which made it sound like there was one hypnosis session where they came up with this cock and bull story. Nonsense. And as a matter of fact, we have it in writing that the emotional intensity in one session each was greater than that in the voices of any of the military guys that Dr. Simon had worked with. He had to stop those sessions. He was afraid they couldn't handle it. The terror is quite clear. And I mention this because you'll hear people saying, what was it I said? Betty didn't get excited. It was like she was taking a stroll in the supermarket. It sure doesn't come across that way when you listen to the tape. Barney is terror-stricken. And remember, there had been no abduction cases that had been publicized. So there's nothing to draw upon about what happened here. If you're being abducted by somebody, are you going to get back? What's going to happen to you? Is your life going down the drain while these guys when they get finished with you, they throw you away? What, you know? So there's an innate terror, aside from their having you under their control and doing physical examinations and other stuff, which none of us are. Nobody wants to be a specimen, which is how they were treated. Fair enough statement?
Yes.
So he was quite a remarkable guy, and it's important to recognize that this was a real expert, not in flying saucers, but in helping people get through difficult experiences. And as they're reliving this experience, they realize that, remember that business about the orb? They saw this light in the road and some men around it and stuff. They remembered that consciously, not very clearly. Now they're going over it. And when you're up in that country, the trees are tall, the road is narrow, no lights.
Oops.
I kept driving and driving, and I made a turn, and I never knew this. I don't know why I had to make that turn. As I say, when you stand at the spot where he first sees the leader through the binoculars, you get the very strong feeling that he was being directed where to go. And the place they wound up was the only place in the area where you could set down a large saucer. Empty lot, I'll call it, sandy area. This is very heavily forested land, and at night it's dark out there, I'll tell you that. The sand is kind of whitish. So he was there because they wanted him there. And from the air, of course, you could see where could you set down a saucer, where could you bring a car in, and so forth and so on. There's the comment when Betty was talking about her dreams. I saw 8 to 11 men standing in the middle of the road. The men surrounded the car. We sat motionless. That's what she said.
Let's listen to the description.
Then I thought, well, you know, are they in a car and the car broken down, or what are they doing there? And Barney, of course, had to stop. And then he stops the car, and these men started to come up to the car. They separated. They came up in 2 groups. And when they started to do that, I got real scared. And the car motor died. The car stalled. And And when they started coming up, Barney tried to start the car. He tried to start it, and you know how a motor of a car would just turn over, and won't fire? And he started to start the car. Tried to start the car, and it won't start. And the minute it goes, and I think, well, I can't get away from this. If I get the car door open, I can run in the woods and hide. And I'm thinking it, and I just put my hand on the car door and open it. And they come up and they open it for me. And they open the car door, and this not very big man. And it's 1, 2, 3. And one man puts his hand down. I don't know what happened.
Did that sound like a trip to the grocery store to you? The emotional level of a trip to the grocery store?
For a woman who's normally very even-toned, this is not an excitable woman.
Now, in Betty's dreams, remember, she dreamed that there were 8 to 11 men. They surrounded the car, and she and Barney sat motionless. You just saw that under hypnosis, that's not what happened. There were 3 who came to her door. Let's see what Barney described.
I thought I saw a cluster of 6 men because 3 came to me and 3 did not. I didn't think of the man in the sky.
Said he didn't think of the man in the sky at that time. Well, as you can see, Barney said that 3 approached him as well. That's not what Betty had in her dreams. There's evidence there that what happened might have been a real event. They both made the same statements, correlating data under hypnosis. That was not in Betty's dream material.
The point is, some people said there was no event, it was just Betty's dream. That was the whole story. That what came out under hypnosis was just Betty's dreams. And Barney picked it up from Betty, and we got no problem here. It's just, wishful thinking. The reality comes out quite different from that. And Barney could, each one was grabbed by 3 people, 3 beings. And Barney could feel the top of his feet bumping against the stones. That's where that scuffed shoes came from. This is the sandy area. They're being transported in quotes separately. 3 with Barney, 3 with Betty. His eyes were pretty much closed. They were under control. You want to keep your specimens from fighting back, in other words. Nobody stuck a needle in them. They wanted them conscious, presumably, so they could do what they were told to do when they were being tested. But that's where the shoe problem seems to have come from. Think of him sort of hanging a little bit and being dragged with his feet behind him on the ground.
Barney stated that he felt as if he were floating somehow, that his arms were extended outward, and that he could just feel the toes of his shoes bumping along those rocks and then sliding along a smooth surface and bumping over a surface at the top of the smooth surface, this ramp.
We'll call it a ramp anyway. Betty was feisty. She was trying to kick these people. She wasn't going to be taken willingly into whatever it was they wanted to do with her. But so 3 guys on each of them managed to get them up this ramp, over a kind of lintel, I'll call it, a doorway kind of base, and they were taken into separate rooms. Remember, this is a clear area here, the only space in the area we could put down this darn saucer, right next to this narrow road where they were grabbed. Somebody was paying attention and planning.
And when Betty struggled at the bottom of this ramp, it's probably the point at which she tore out the lining of her dress and tore down her hem.
Much more sensible, and she's sitting in the car and suddenly these things happen. Barney later drew this picture of what things looked like on board. He had a compass. He was up this way into a room. There was a table and cabinet. This was a circular craft with pie-shaped room wedges, going around it. They were not in the same rooms for their examination. Neither one was witness to what was going on with the other one.
Some people have said that Betty recalled aliens who looked very different from the ones that Barney recalled. They're getting Betty's dreams confused with Betty's hypnotic recall. This is what the beings looked like in Betty's dreams. They looked a lot like Jimmy Durante, Southern European-looking, dark, thick hair, dark eyebrows, human ears, human eyes, large noses, lips that had a bluish tint, and a kind of a grayish skin, and they were dressed in blue cadet-type uniforms in her dreams. But this is what Betty and Barney described and remembered during the hypnosis sessions that they had with Dr. Simon. And this is a drawing done by New Hampshire artist David Baker. He actually painted this in watercolors. And this was the rendition of the leader. Now, David Baker did his drawings based upon his knowledge of human anatomy. So they might be slightly different from what Betty and Barney observed. Betty and Barney said, though, that they had large chest cavities. It was almost as if they had barrel chests, completely round, rather than being wider this way and thinner this way. There was a membrane that covered their mouths, and this membrane fluttered when they spoke to each other in this kind of humming or buzzing sound. But Betty and Barney understood them in English, although they never saw their mouths move when they were communicating with Betty and Barney.
Telepathy to me, anyway.
They had large slanted eyes, which Betty and Barney said had sort of square sides, and Betty thought they had a vertical cat-like slit for a pupil. And they both said that the iris almost completely filled up the eye, and there was a little bit of yellow around the edges. So what you see in David Baker's painting is a little bit different from what Betty and Barney actually described in their written accounts. The leader was approximately 5 feet tall, and let's take a look now at the examiner. This is more what Betty and Barney actually described. This painting was done by New Mexico artist Patrick Richard, and he was actually a friend of Betty when he lived in New Hampshire. The examiner looked about the same as the leader, only they said he or she had a weaker chin. They weren't sure if this was a male or a female. It was approximately 4.5 feet tall, communicated in English again. They were all dressed in black, tight-fitting, shiny clothing. And in Barney's original reports to Walter Webb, back in October of 1961, he described shiny black uniforms. Betty later described long, narrow palms and very long fingers, maybe 4 or 5. She wasn't sure which. This is a side view, a sketch by David Baker. And there was a being on board that Betty and Barney didn't reveal to the public. They were asked not to talk about this particular one by the scientists who were studying their case. This is the one I call the supervisor, because this little being stood out in the dark hallway looking in at Betty as she was being examined, and frightened her terribly. He was about 3.5 feet tall. He resembled the others in a sense, but he was different at the same time. His head was larger in proportion to the size of his body than the leader and the examiner. And he had these very dark irises in his eyes. He had a broad, flat nose and a wide, thin mouth. And he was very hostile and threatening. At the end, this was the one that took the book away from Betty. If you're familiar with the story, there was a book that she wanted to keep that she found on the craft. It didn't look like our books, but it was like a book. And he was the one who saw it. And she told me that he was almost screaming when he saw that she had that book. And then it was taken away from her.
She had asked for something to take with early on to prove that this event had happened. And she saw the book, grabbed it, and she's getting ready to leave. And this blankety blank is telling her, no, you can't take it with you. I'll remember. You won't remember. It was a nasty scene there.
Well, Betty and Barney said that their physical examinations involved an examination of their skeletal structures. These beings seemed to be very interested in the difference between human skeletons and their own, whatever that might be. Betty and Barney noted that they seemed oddly jointed, and when they walked very differently from us. It was almost as if they were gliding or stumbling along or almost skating. It's really hard to describe. They examined Betty's and Barney's hands, their feet. They took their shoes off. They examined their joints to see how human joints moved. They looked into their eyes. They scraped their skin. They looked into their mouths. There were reproductive experiments done, probably. A needle was placed in Betty's navel, and the cup was placed over Barney's groin. Many specimens were taken from all of the orifices in their bodies. And this is Betty on the examining table, painting done by Patrick Richard again, and the needle in the navel experiment. And I want to play for you now Betty's description under hypnosis.
So then they roll me over on my back. And the examiner has a long needle in his hand. And I see the needle. And it's bigger than any needle I've ever seen. And I asked him what he's going to do with it. And he said, just a simple test, it won't hurt me. And I asked him what. And he said he just wants to put it in my navel. And it's just a simple test. And I told him, no, it won't hurt. Don't do it. Don't do it. And he said, no, it won't hurt. And he sticks a needle into my navel. And said, and I'm crying and I tell him it's hurting, take it out. And then the leader, he goes over and he puts his hand, runs his hand in front of my eyes. And he says, I'll be all right. I won't feel it. And all the pain goes away.
Just a simple walk in the supermarket, you can tell that.
This is a session in which Dr. Simon had to end the session early due to the emotional intensity. He didn't want to cause Betty to relive any further trauma during that session. And by the way, that was before the development of amniocentesis.
They did say it was a pregnancy test, which didn't make any sense at the time. My wife has had amniocentesis, the needle in the navel routine. Nobody was doing it at this time.
Now, I have another tape that I want to play before Stan
Okay. We're
talks
running
to you
short
again.
of time, incidentally.
So let's play this.
He went over across the room to the head of the table, and he did something. He opened up, it wasn't like a drawer. He sort of did something in the metal of the wall. There was an opening, and he pulled down a map. And he asked me, had I ever seen a map like this before? And I walked across the room, and I leaned against the table, and I looked at it. And it was a map of, it was an oblong map. It wasn't square. It was wider than it was long. And there were always dots on it. And they were scattered all over it. Some were a little, just pinpoints, and others were as big as a nickel. And there were lines. There were, on some of the dots, there were curved lines going from one dot to another. And there was one big circle, and it had a lot of lines coming out from it. A lot of lines going to another circle quite close, but not as big. And these were heavy lines. And I asked him what they meant. And he said that the heavy lines were trade routes. And then the other lines, the solid lines, were places they went occasionally. He said that the broken lines were expeditions. So I asked him where was his home port? And he said, where are you on this map? And I looked and I laughed and I said, I don't know. So he said, well then, if you don't know where you are, there wouldn't be any point of my telling you where I am.
Wise guy alien is all I can say. This was preceded by Betty asking him where they were from. and saying, I know you're not from around here, the understatement of the month. And that's when he showed her this map. And so this was followed by Dr. Simon is listening to this under hypnosis. This is reliving, it's not retelling. And he asked Betty, I mean, you can imagine how Dr. Simon felt. Here he's got a sensible person telling him a story about trade routes and occasional expeditions, and, you know, where's this all coming from? And so he asked Betty if she can remember what the map looks like. She says yes. And he gives her a post-hypnotic suggestion. If and only if she can remember it accurately, please draw it later on. And she does. She goes home and she draws it. And there it is. And base stars and, you know, trade routes and occasional expeditions. How the heck are you going to make any sense out of that? I mean, a galaxy has 100, 200 billion stars in it. We have no points of reference. It might suggest that the Earth was on here or the sun was on here somewhere because they're here. But beyond that, we'll never know, so it seemed. Until a brilliant woman named Marjorie Fish did something nobody else had ever done. She built 26 different three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood. That's Marjorie. That's really me. I did have black hair a long time ago. This is in the early 70s. She was a school teacher. She built these models. Her whole point was to see if she had visited Betty and gotten more information, to see if she could find a three-dimensional pattern that matched the two-dimensional drawing that Betty had drawn. She thought she'd find many matches. At first, she didn't find any. Now, her models were limited by information on how the distance to the stars and how many you can put in a model. Out about 50 light years was the most you could get in a cube kind of thing. She expected to find many matches. She didn't find any, using all the stars. Then she started cutting back on which stars she showed, getting to the kind that scientists then said were the ones that ought to have planets and life, maybe. Not all stars would be expected. They might be too old, too new, to have another star too close, all kinds of restrictions. Finally, when she got some good distance data, the astronomers aren't going anywhere, so they don't care how far away the stars are. You need two angles to find a star. And whether it's 20 light years away or 40 light years away doesn't matter. But if you're trying to get a three-dimensional pattern of where things come from, the distances matter entirely. And when a new catalog came out, the finally Wilhelm Gliese new catalog of nearby star distances, you heard the word Gliese. 3 weeks ago, there was talk about a planet 581c, 581g. That's the same Gliese. The star is 581. The G refers to the fifth, I guess it's fifth or sixth planet around that star. And this may be in the Goldilocks zone and may have planets and life and all this. It may have life. Anyway, she finally found one and only one pattern that matched angle for line, line length for line length, what Betty had drawn. It was a big moment. This is one of her models. Each of those beads stands for a particular star in its proper three-dimensional location. And she had help from the staff at Ohio State University Astronomy Department, Dr. Mitchell. He's in my movie, UFOs Are Real, saying how accurate her work was. She was a school teacher. She was a member of Mensa. Brilliant, objective person, Marjorie was. And this is the identity of those stars. The distances then aren't quite accurate. The Hipparcos satellite has made millions of measurements of better distances, finally. The sun is up here. That's the important thing, our star. The base stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli. That's the constellation of Reticulum, which means the net. You can't see it from here. You got to go down to the southern hemisphere to see it. These two stars are very special. They're the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire local neighborhood. Our star, the sun, is out in the boondocks. Next star over, 4.3 light years away. These two stars from each other are only 1/8 of a light year apart. That's 30 times closer to each other than we are to the next star over. We're out in the boonies. These guys got next door neighbors. And those two stars are at least 1 billion years older than the sun. 1 billion years. Now, the fact that they're so close means from a planet around one looking at the other, it's visible all day long. And with that billion years and that short distances, there's plenty of time and more incentive to develop interstellar travel a long time ago. You got a next door neighbor. And you can tell, because you're so close, that there's life of some kind around the other star, around the planets around the other stars. So it's a very exciting discovery. Now, the SETI people will tell you, we listened to those stars and we didn't get a signal. SETI really stands for Silly Effort to Investigate. To suggest that aliens are stuck at our level of radio communication technology we've had for about 100 years is pretty silly. I don't use the slide rule anymore. I doubt if aliens are using our communication technology now. But this is your target if you want to go someplace. They're only 39.3 light years away from here. So that's in the local neighborhood. Now, several special things. All the stars connected by lines are sun-like stars. It's only true of 5% of the stars in our neighborhood. Is between 1,000 and 2,000 stars within 55 light years. We keep finding new small stars. That's the first thing. All the pattern stars are sun-like, even though only 5% of the stars in the neighborhood are sun-like. And all the sun-like stars in that very well described hunk of space are part of the pattern. The chance of that being a coincidence are 1 in 10,000 to 1 in a million. They're all in a plane, the stars connected by lines, like slices of pepperoni on a pizza, big flat pizza, as opposed to raisins in a big fat loaf of raisin bread. That makes transport a lot easier when you're in a plane. The planets in the solar system are in a plane, amazingly. So there you go. It's a very exciting, challenging work. I'm very proud to have been the first to publish about it. I was asked to help Marjorie by the head of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. That's how I got involved. I met with her a couple of times, 3 times anyway. Very exciting piece of work, and she's one of the most objective people I've ever met. Now, here's that question about the book that we mentioned earlier, about the nasty supervisor taking it away from her. Here's what Betty said. The book seemed to be constructed of thin, stiff, shiny plastic, maybe 1 inch thick. Text seemed to be embedded in the plastic. It was in about 6 columns going down with symbols. What those symbols mean, I don't know. Can we decode them? I doubt it. We don't have, this is one of those places where you wish Dr. Simon had asked for more information, please, you know. But he didn't. But it was something different anyway. Yeah.
Let's get back to the comparative analysis I did on the hypnosis tapes, where I transcribed Betty's and Barney's statements and lined them up and compared them to Betty's statements in her dream. And although I have several examples in the book, I'm using only 2 examples here due to our time constraints. But in Betty's dream, she said that she and Barney returned to the car at the same time. They stood by the side of the car, and they watched the UFO leave. Then they entered the vehicle, and they took off. Well, let's go back. That's not what happened on the hypnosis tapes. On the hypnosis tapes, Barney was escorted to the car first. He was placed in the driver's seat and he sat on his gun. He was sitting there wondering where Betty was, and he saw her coming down the path. Betty had actually been back on the craft arguing because she wanted to keep that book, and she was furious that it had been taken away from her.
She was feisty.
And then the leader took her down the path, and she entered the car. She picked up her dog. The leader had told her that she could stop, she could stand by the side of the car and watch the craft leave. He thought it would be safe for them to do that. So then she asked Barney to get out of the car and watch the craft leave, which they did. So this was completely different from the information that Betty had recorded in her dreams, indicating that it might have been a real experience, and not that Betty had simply repeated her dreams under hypnosis, and that Barney had somehow absorbed the information in Betty's dreams.
Osmosis.
And repeated it.
And so, after many attempts to find the location, Dr. Simon had given a suggestion that they would find the location. They did find it in this area. This is an aerial view. This is a dark, at night, lonely road, no lights. And there's now a house here. There wasn't then. And it's sandy, and they recalled the soil being sandy. And it's the only place around that's like this. So they're satisfied. The people who live in the house didn't know about this being the place where this experience had taken place, incidentally. But when you're out here, as we were, at night, in the dark, it's a closed-in sort of place. I mean, the trees are tall. They're not little scrubby things. And so it's a unique location. You can see looking around there. There aren't any other places in the woods. This is not a place for spectators, in other words. The guys who ran this show knew what they were doing.
This is Betty standing on the site.
Before the house was built, obviously.
Yes.
They went on home. You can see the distances on the map here. 37 miles to Concord. From here it's 17. 47 miles to Portsmouth. And people have said, oh, they got lost on mountain roads. There aren't many roads around the area. There's no way. Kathy tried to get lost. She didn't succeed.
If they had traveled along Route 3, it would have been only 16 miles from the field, the close encounter field, to Plymouth, New Hampshire. If they had traveled on Route 175, it would have been 21 miles. There's no way to account for that 2 hours of missing time.
They were, give you an idea of their involvement in the community. Barney was on the Governor's Civil Rights Commission, very active in politics. Betty was active in politics. They got invited to the inauguration of Lyndon Johnson, January 20th, 1965. And Kathy here went with them. She got an invitation too. So the point of this is not to brag about that. We're talking about upstanding citizens of the community. These are not people who were looking, how can we make up a story and have a crummy book put out and make a lot of money? This is not what we're talking about here. These were people who had everything to lose and nothing to gain by going public against their will. There's Barney with Senator McIntyre of New Hampshire at the inauguration. He's appointed to the New Hampshire State Advisory Committee on Civil Rights Commission. This is respectability. And remember, those were difficult days in the civil rights movement. You may remember the early 60s. There was a lot of foment, a lot of stuff going on. This is them in 1965 with that first newspaper article, which started the whole ball rolling, unfortunately or not, whatever you want to say.
Through a violation of confidentiality and against their will.
The story's told in the book in great detail, but there they are with Delsey in 1966.
They had at that point agreed to tell the full story, and John Fuller had asked if he could write the book about their experience.
Well-known author, sharp guy. I've looked at the comments. There was an agreement that Dr. Simon would have final say on everything. And boy, was he rough on Fuller. The papers are at Boston University archives, the original manuscript and Simon's comments on the manuscript. And boy, he made him toe the line.
Well, in the book, I also wrote 2 chapters on the psychophysics experiments that Betty agreed to participate in with Robert Homan and C.D. Jackson, who were 2 employees at IBM. Robert Homan was a writer, and C.D. Jackson was a senior engineer. and Betty had agreed to do psychophysics experiments.
Call them in.
Try to call them in with some limited success, you will see. Betty also went out. She was trying to vector in craft. This was a photograph taken years later after Barney's death in 1969. And we don't really know what this is, but Betty found it interesting. You can see the shape here. It hovered above her vehicle. This photograph is enlarged. On the original slide, there appears to be someone standing in this window. It doesn't show up well here. She also took this photograph of a fiery orb. We don't know what that is either. And now we've come to the end, and this is our book Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience, and our new book, Science Was Wrong. And thank you very much for listening to us.
There are all kinds of crazy stories. One of the things about important stories, like Roswell and the Hill case, is that the nasty, noisy negativists really work overtime trying to put out garbage. And you'll see every aspect of each case being attacked by somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about, or if he does is intentionally lying, and I'm not going to pass judgment on that. You know, why they went on a trip. Betty had a week's vacation coming. Barney wanted to do something. They were fairly newly married. Celebrate in a special way. Betty had never been to Niagara Falls. Barney got time off from work. Well, she had a vacation. And they decided to go to Niagara Falls. Everybody's romantic objective, if you will. This is sort of like a honeymoon for them. And you may not recognize this person, but she's standing right here. This is Kathleen. And at the time, she was 13 years old. Should I say that? Yeah, you're not supposed to tell a woman's age, but that's all right. This was a girl's age, was 13. She had been at Niagara Falls. And so she had told them about her trip. And that helped them understand, you know, why it was worth going there and so forth. The objective here was to drive to Niagara Falls, come back through Montreal, come on back home. They'd have a great weekend. You know, a break in the activities. But Kathy was around at the time, and there are some people who will tell you she was only 3 years old at the time. How does she know what was going on? They left off that little one. 13 and 3 are not the same, in case you hadn't noticed. Next one. So they were following a route. They'd gone over to Niagara Falls, which is from Thousand Islands. They came up through Montreal, had a great time in Montreal, and headed east from Montreal to Coaticook. I got it. I think I pronounced it properly.
Yes.
Close enough. Down through Colebrook. There's a border between Canada and the United States here. This is lovely farmland, dairy farms. I've been on that road. A rural area. Montreal isn't rural, believe me, but the countryside is. And things were going as one might expect them to go. They had thought they might stay over in Montreal. Barney got lost. All the signs were in French, and he didn't speak French. And so after they got through the town, they decided, oh, what the heck, he was feeling great. We could drive on home to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. These are not busy roads once you get past Montreal. It was at night. He was accustomed to working at night. So away we go. Next slide. Here's Coaticook, and it's Kathleen's turn to say something.
Betty and Barney stopped for dinner in Coaticook.
In rural New Hampshire. This is off-season. This is before the leaves turn beautiful. There's nothing much going on. No traffic. Very few things open of a commercial nature any place along this route. It's country. Pure and simple country. So don't be fooled by the cars. No traffic. Okay. And then they're driving south, Betty, on the right, in the passenger seat, of course, saw a strange new light in the sky. She was watching the sky. The skies are clear and beautiful down there. This is not Smogsville country at all, and as you'll see, the weather was great. And they saw this new light in the sky, except it was sort of like a meteor, except it was going up. Next slide. They were going from north to south, as you could see there. Okay, the first interview that was done at any length with them, after they made an initial report to Pease, the local police, and then Pease Air Force Base, was done by Walter Webb. He was a wheel at the planetarium in Boston, a lecturer. When he finished, I guess he was assistant directors. He was an investigator for the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, one of the two major groups at that time, APRO and NICAP, Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. Now, after the event we'll be talking about, Betty went to the library, got a book out by Major Donald Kehoe, who had pretty much founded NICAP and was director, and it had an address to which you could write to report a sighting, and they requested that sightings be reported. And so she wrote a letter detailing what happened during this experience, as far as she knew at the time, anyway. And they, in turn, passed this on to Walter Webb. NICAP was in Washington, D.C. We're talking about New Hampshire. Nearest big city, Boston, of course. Walter Webb was their big shot investigator in Boston. They passed Betty's letter, naturally typed. She was a social worker. She was a supervisor in the welfare department of state of New Hampshire. She was accustomed to writing reports. And it was detailed. So Walter called them within a couple of days after getting the letter from NICAP and arranged to meet them. And so we have a copy of that report. He's still around, incidentally. A little older, as most of us are now. And there's a quote here. The couple initially thought they were observing a falling star, only it moved upward, a plane or a satellite. Next slide. There were bright, you can see that up there. The first stop was near Twin Mountain. Now we're getting up to 11:20 p.m., even quieter. Nothing going on. Peaceful countryside. No hoodlums. There were bright. The story has been being told for some time, since the late 60s. It's not a new story. We have done a lot of research that puts information out that hasn't been put out before, the new book captured. But it's an important story on several different levels. It was the first abduction experience to get any serious attention. It wasn't the first abduction. First one to get attention. In John Fuller's book, The Interrupted Journey. Now, it got attention in spite of the efforts of Betty and Barney, because they were very much concerned about what the impact would be on their lives if this story got out. Betty was a social worker, a supervisor in the welfare department, state of New Hampshire. Barney worked for the post office, was very active in civil rights. The last thing they needed was public attention about the strangest story you can imagine. Bad enough to see a flying saucer. People have been seeing them for years, many years. Even seeing crash flying saucers, as you heard in the previous talk. But now we're not talking about dead bodies. We're talking about live ones. We're not talking about wreckage. We're talking about a craft that comes down, does its thing, and leaves. Takes them on board against their will. This is a crazy story. So they made every effort to keep the story from getting out in the public because they were honestly and sincerely concerned about what it would mean to their lives, their jobs. As you may have noticed, this is an interracial couple. This was 1961 in New Hampshire. Such couples were not very common. Very special people. And I surprised some people by pointing out that even though you notice Barney died in 1969, February, I met him. He and Betty and I had dinner in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1968, November. And it was interesting because I got a call from the big radio station, big television station, KDKA. And I got started in public involvement on UFOs because I did a program on KDKA called, surprisingly enough, Contact. It was a call-in show. And I had asked Frank Edwards, who had a best-selling book about flying saucers, I said, I want to go public, Frank. I had met Frank. I'd been active for several years in finding out about saucers. Give me some names, Frank. You know everybody. He was a newsman in Indianapolis. He gave me some names in Pittsburgh, where I was living and working for Westinghouse. And one of them was the producer of this show, Contact. And I called them and gave them a spiel. And usually, being a nuclear physicist working for Westinghouse were gold-plated credentials in Pittsburgh. You know, you want to buy a house, how much do you want to borrow, that kind of thing. But their response was pretty much, don't call us, we'll call you. Well, less than a month later, they called me at 6:30 at night. Could I please be on their show at 7 o'clock? Somebody had canceled at the last minute, and Lord knows how many people they called before they got somebody like me who was willing to go on the show. So I did the show. I wasn't as good at handling the noisy negativists then as I am now. But somebody at work at Westinghouse heard me, asked me to talk to her book review club, which was looking at Frank's book. I gave my first lecture in her living room. I did the show many times over the next couple of years. And finally, after I'd done several shows for them, I got a call. Betty and Barney Hill are coming to town. We thought you might like to know. Now, normally, stations won't do that. They protect their guests. So they called me, told me what hotel they were staying at. I called them, went down, we had dinner together. I was very favorably impressed by them. I mean, I'd read the Look magazine article and John Fuller's book and so forth. So I can truthfully say I had a chance to interact with the both of them. I've seen Betty many times since. At her home, we did television shows, The Tomorrow Show, other shows. My movie, UFOs Are Real, there's some copies outside. Interview done at Betty's house. So, a very special twosome here. And if you look at the dates, you'll see Betty lived a much longer time than Barney. So these are the protagonists in this interesting story. But people with excellent reputations in their community who did not seek out publicity, talked to a lawyer about keeping the story from coming out. He said, there's nothing you can do. A reporter got a hold of it who wanted to interview them from a Boston newspaper, and it was the last thing they wanted, but he wanted to interview Dr. Simon, the psychiatrist. He wasn't having any either. So it's an interesting saga. This was second marriages. Well, they both had been married before. And a very special couple. Let's look at the next slide. And another character in this drama was Delcy, their dog, who was with them on the trip and whose behavior indicated great concern, at some time hiding under the seat, as I recall it. But she's not the little critter we want to talk about the most tonight. Let's look at the next slide. Now, you'll hear
Cook. They decided to use up the remainder of their Canadian money, and you might have heard that Barney was very upset during this trip because he had encountered some hoodlums who gave him a rough time about being married to a white woman. That is false. What actually happened is that Betty and Barney went into a restaurant. There were two young men in there who had what Barney described as duck bill haircuts, and it reminded him of the haircuts that hoodlum types were wearing at that time frame. But they were conventionally dressed, and Barney stated that they were very nice young men. They had a nice dinner in the restaurant, and then they left. After they left, they traveled through the Canadian countryside toward Vermont and then on to New Hampshire. This is one of the attractive farms that they passed along the way. And during the hypnosis, during this time frame, Dr. Simon was asking Barney how he felt, what his emotional state was. And I want to play for you now, in Barney's own words, how he felt.
I felt in good spirits. I felt in high spirits. I was well rested from the night before, and we had spent a delightful day. And I knew I could drive on from the White Mountains down to Portsmouth, so I didn't stop. I didn't feel too tired.
I hope that you could hear that. It was what he stated is written up there on the screen. Well, then they drove on and they passed through customs and Canaan, Vermont, without any problems. And this is the route that they took. Here's Colebrook. This would have been their first stop after they left Canada. They got gasoline there and stopped at a restaurant again for a cup of coffee. Then they went on to Lancaster, the next city down, along Route 3, the major route that ran through northern New Hampshire. It still is the only major route in that part of northern New Hampshire. And then on to Twin Mountain. This is the town of Colebrook. They stopped at a restaurant there, Howard's Restaurant, and just had a cup of coffee. They knew it was the last opportunity they'd have probably to have a cup of coffee that night before they went home. And as they were leaving the restaurant, they noticed it was about 10 o'clock.
p.m. Things are quieting down in New Hampshire.